On a warm summer morning in Sarajevo, June 28, 1914, the cobblestone streets were lined with curious onlookers awaiting the arrival of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. The air was thick with anticipation as the royal motorcade made its way through the city, the sound of horses' hooves and automobile engines echoing off the historic buildings. The Archduke and his beloved wife Sophie had come to inspect imperial armed forces in Bosnia and Herzegovina, recently annexed territories that were still a source of tension in the Balkans. What neither the Archduke nor the crowds knew was that 7 young Serbian nationalists from the secret organization known as the Black Hand were positioned along the motorcade route. They carried weapons and cyanide pills, determined to strike a blow against Habsburg rule. The morning sun cast long shadows as the first assassination attempt failed. A bomb thrown by Nedeljko Chabranovic bounced off the folded-back convertible top of the Archduke's car, exploding behind it and injuring several officers in the following vehicle. After this initial chaos, the Archduke continued to the town hall for his scheduled appearance, though the atmosphere had grown tense and uncertain. Later, when leaving the town hall, a fateful decision was made to visit the injured officers at the hospital. Due to a miscommunication about the route change, the drivers took a wrong turn onto Franz Joseph Street. As they attempted to reverse, they stopped directly in front of Gavrilo Princip, one of the conspirators who had believed the assassination plot had failed. In the quiet moment that followed, Princip stepped forward and fired 2 shots from his Belgian-made FN Model 1910 pistol. The first struck Sophie in the abdomen, while the second hit the Archduke in the neck. The sound of the gunshots reverberated through the narrow street as bystanders stood in shocked silence. Within minutes, both the Archduke and his wife had slipped away, their last words to each other barely whispered as their lifeblood ebbed. The death sent ripples of shock through Europe's carefully balanced political system. In the days that followed, as the news spread by telegraph and newspaper, the streets of Vienna filled with mourners, while in Belgrade, tensions mounted as Austria-Hungary began making demands of Serbia. The warm summer air grew heavy with the weight of impending crisis, as diplomatic cables crossed Europe like threads in an increasingly tangled web. Few could have imagined that these shots in Sarajevo would echo through history as the trigger that would plunge Europe into its greatest conflict yet. In the sweltering summer heat of July 1914, Europe entered what would become known as the July Crisis, a month of mounting tensions and diplomatic exchanges that would ultimately lead to the outbreak of the Great War. As news of Archduke Franz Ferdinand's assassination spread across the continent, government offices hummed with activity, while citizens went about their daily lives, not yet aware of how their world was about to change forever. The Austrian leadership, particularly Foreign Minister Leopold von Berchtold, spent the early days of July carefully crafting their response to the assassination. In the quiet meeting rooms of Vienna's Ballhausplatz, officials debated various courses of action, their voices echoing off ornate walls as they considered how to deal with Serbia. The air was thick with tension as they drafted what would become known as the July Ultimatum. Meanwhile, in Belgrade, Serbian officials anxiously awaited Austria-Hungary's response, while going through the motions of investigating the assassination plot. The summer streets were filled with people discussing the events in hushed tones, wondering what consequences might follow. In Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm II had departed for his annual North Sea cruise, believing the crisis would pass like so many before it. On July 23rd, the Austrian ambassador to Serbia delivered the ultimatum to the Serbian government. The document contained 10 demanding points, including requirements for Serbia to suppress anti-Austrian publications and allow Austrian officials to participate in the assassination investigation. Serbia was given just 48 hours to respond, creating an atmosphere of urgent deliberation in Belgrade's government offices. The following days saw a flurry of diplomatic communications crossing Europe. Telegraph operators worked through long nights, their machines clicking steadily as messages passed between capitals. In St. Petersburg, Russian officials began quietly preparing for potential military mobilization, while in Paris, President Poincaré and Prime Minister Viviani were returning from a state visit to Russia aboard the France, largely out of communication during crucial days. Serbia's response on July 25 accepted most of the ultimatum's demands but rejected direct Austrian involvement in their judicial process. The reply was crafted carefully, designed to appear conciliatory while preserving Serbian sovereignty. However, Austria-Hungary had already decided that only complete acceptance would suffice. In Vienna's coffeehouses, citizens read newspaper headlines with growing concern, though few imagined the approaching catastrophe. The final days of July saw the crisis deepen as Russia began partial mobilization to support Serbia, while Germany warned against such actions. The gentle summer evenings were filled with an unsettling quiet as Europe's capitals waited to see what would unfold. Diplomatic efforts continued, but the machinery of war was already beginning to move, its gears turning inexorably toward conflict. As tensions reached their breaking point in late July 1914, the machinery of war began to grind into motion across Europe. The process of mobilization, the complex orchestration of moving millions of men, horses, and supplies to strategic positions, commenced like a slow-moving tide that would soon become unstoppable. In the warm summer air, the sound of military boots on cobblestone streets and the distant whistle of trains became increasingly common across the continent. Russia was the first major power to announce full mobilization on July 30, 1914, setting in motion a carefully planned sequence of events that had been developed over years of military planning. The following day, Austria-Hungary responded with its own general mobilization, while Germany issued an ultimatum to Russia to halt its military preparations. The gentle summer breeze carried the sound of church bells and town criers, announcing mobilization orders in villages and cities across these vast empires. In France, yellow mobilization posters appeared on walls and public buildings on August 1st, calling reservists to duty. Men quietly gathered their belongings, bid farewell to their families, and made their way to designated assembly points. The French mobilization system, organized by railway timetables, began moving troops toward the eastern frontier with remarkable efficiency. Germany declared war on Russia on August 1st, setting the Schlieffen Plan into motion, their carefully crafted strategy to fight a two-front war. The next day, German troops began crossing into Luxembourg, while diplomatic messages crossed Europe with increasing urgency. On August 3rd, Germany declared war on France, and the following day German forces entered neutral Belgium, prompting Britain to send its own ultimatum to Germany. The streets of London, Paris, Berlin, and Vienna filled with crowds, some cheering with patriotic fervor, others standing in silent contemplation of what was to come. Young men lined up at recruitment offices, while military bands played stirring marches in town squares. In railway stations across Europe, the steady rhythm of departing trains carried soldiers toward their designated positions. By August 4th, Britain had declared war on Germany, transforming what began as a localized conflict into a truly global confrontation. The British Expeditionary Force began its methodical preparation for deployment to France, while the Royal Navy quietly took up its war stations across the world's oceans. Throughout the empire, from Canada to Australia, similar scenes of mobilization unfolded as Britain's dominions pledged their support. The machinery of mobilization moved with an inexorable momentum, like the hands of a great clock that could not be turned back. Within just a few weeks, millions of men had been transformed from civilians into soldiers, and the nations of Europe had crossed the threshold into what would become the most devastating conflict the world had yet known. As the declarations of war echoed across Europe in those early August days of 1914, an extraordinary wave of public enthusiasm swept through the nations involved. In cities and towns across the continent, crowds gathered in streets and squares, their voices rising in patriotic songs and cheers. The warm summer air carried the sound of brass bands playing national anthems, while young men eagerly lined up at recruitment offices, their faces bright with anticipation. In Berlin, jubilant crowds assembled before the Kaiser's palace, their collective voice rising in renditions of Deutschland über alles. Similar scenes unfolded in Paris, where citizens marched down the Champs-Élysées singing La Marseillaise, the atmosphere electric with a sense of national unity and purpose. In London, thousands gathered in Trafalgar Square, their spirits high as they waved Union Jacks and celebrated what many believed would be a short, victorious conflict. This initial enthusiasm was fueled by decades of nationalist education, romantic notions of military glory, and a widespread belief that the war would be over by Christmas. Newspapers played a crucial role in fostering this mood, publishing stirring editorials and patriotic poems. In Vienna, the coffee houses buzzed with excited conversations about defending Austrian honor, while in St. Petersburg, Russians spoke of protecting their Slavic brothers. Young men rushed to enlist, fearing the war might end before they could participate. In Britain, groups of friends and colleagues joined up together, forming what became known as PALS battalions. Factory workers, office clerks, and university students stood shoulder to shoulder in recruitment lines, their shared excitement masking the gravity of what lay ahead. Women, too, embraced the war effort with remarkable dedication. They organized charity drives, prepared care packages for soldiers, and began training as nurses. In every belligerent nation, civilian societies mobilized to support their armed forces, creating a vast network of voluntary organizations. Yet beneath this surface of enthusiasm, there were also voices of caution and dissent. Socialist groups in various countries organized peace demonstrations, though these were often drowned out by the overwhelming tide of patriotic fervor. In rural areas, farmers watched their sons depart with quiet concern, understanding that the harvest would still need to be brought in. The enthusiasm of these early days would gradually transform as the reality of modern warfare became apparent. But in those warm August days of 1914, most Europeans embraced the conflict with an optimism that seems almost unfathomable in retrospect. They could not yet know that their world was about to change forever, as the old certainties of the 19th century gave way to the harsh realities of 20th century industrial warfare. As the warm summer days of August 1914 unfolded, the carefully laid military plans of Europe's great powers began to take shape. The German military, following their long-established Schlieffen Plan, commenced their sweeping advance through neutral Belgium, their gray-uniformed soldiers moving steadily across the peaceful countryside. The plan, developed years earlier by Count Alfred von Schlieffen, envisioned a vast wheeling movement through Belgium to encircle and defeat France before turning to face Russia in the east. The Belgian army, though small, put up unexpected resistance at fortified positions like Liege, where ancient stone fortresses stood against modern artillery. The delay caused by this resistance would prove crucial in the coming weeks. Meanwhile, French troops in their distinctive red trousers and blue coats advanced into Alsace-Lorraine, following their Plan XVII, which called for a direct offensive into the lost provinces. In the east, Russian forces moved with surprising speed into East Prussia, their boots trudging through summer dust as they advanced faster than German planners had anticipated. The quiet farming communities of East Prussia soon found themselves caught in the path of advancing armies. The German Eighth Army, commanded by Generals Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, prepared to meet this threat. British forces, led by Sir John French, crossed the English Channel in mid-August, their khaki uniforms a stark contrast to the colorful French ones. The British Expeditionary Force, though small, was professional and well-trained, taking up positions alongside French forces near the Belgian border. The sound of marching boots and wagon wheels filled the air as armies numbering millions moved across Europe's landscape. In Serbia, Austro-Hungarian forces launched their first offensive, crossing the Drina River as summer storms rolled across the Balkans. The Serbian army, veterans of recent Balkan wars, withdrew into their mountainous territory, preparing for a defensive strategy that would prove remarkably effective. These opening moves of the war unfolded like a complex chess game, with each nation following pre-planned strategies that had been developed over decades of peace. The warm summer air carried the distant rumble of artillery as modern industrial warfare began to reshape the peaceful European countryside. Farmers harvesting their crops could see columns of soldiers marching past their fields, while in cities, people gathered around newspaper boards to follow the latest developments. As August drew to a close, the true nature of modern warfare began to emerge, though few yet recognized how different this conflict would be from the wars of the past. The carefully laid plans of military strategists would soon face the reality of 20th-century combat, as armies of unprecedented size maneuvered across the continent in these crucial opening weeks of what would become known as the Great War. As the armies began to move in the late summer of 1914, the German military put into motion a carefully crafted strategy that had been years in development. Known as the Schlieffen Plan, named after its architect Count Alfred von Schlieffen, this ambitious military blueprint had been designed to address Germany's greatest strategic challenge, the prospect of fighting a two-front war against both France and Russia. In the quiet planning rooms of the German General Staff, Schlieffen had spent countless hours contemplating how to avoid the nightmare scenario of being caught between two powerful enemies. His solution, refined over many peaceful evenings between 1891 and 1905, proposed a bold and sweeping movement through neutral Belgium and Luxembourg, using the flat, open terrain to quickly encircle and defeat France before Russia could fully mobilize in the east. The plan called for a massive right wing of German forces, like a great sweeping arm, to pass through Belgium and curve around Paris, while a smaller force in the south would draw French armies toward Alsace-Lorraine. In Schlieffen's original vision, the ratio was to be stark. Nearly 90% of German forces would participate in the northern offensive, leaving only minimal forces in the east against Russia. However, by 1914, his successor Helmuth von Moltke the Younger had modified the plan significantly. In the quiet summer days before the war, Moltke reduced the strength of the crucial right wing, diverting more forces to the Eastern Front and Alsace-Lorraine. These alterations would prove fateful in the weeks to come. As German soldiers marched through the Belgian countryside, their boots crushing the summer wheat in endless columns, the modified Schlieffen Plan began to show its limitations. The Belgian army, rather than yielding as expected, put up determined resistance in their fortified cities. Each day of delay allowed more time for Russian mobilization in the east, while British forces crossed the Channel to support France. The gentle rolling hills and fertile fields of northern France, which had seemed so inviting on military maps, became increasingly difficult terrain as summer heat, exhaustion, and extended supply lines took their toll on the advancing German armies. The original elegant simplicity of Schlieffen's concept, to sweep around Paris with overwhelming force, gradually gave way to a more complicated and uncertain reality. By early September, as autumn began to touch the leaves with gold, the German advance had slowed significantly. The massive wheeling movement that was meant to envelope Paris instead began to drift eastward, creating vulnerabilities that Allied forces would soon exploit in the upcoming Battle of the Marne. As the German forces advanced through Belgium in August 1914, the first major battles of the Western Front began to unfold in a series of encounters that would shape the nature of the conflict. The Belgian army, though smaller than the other forces, fought with determination to slow the German advance, particularly at the fortified city of Liege, where the resistance lasted from August 5th to August 16th. The French army, following their plan XVII, moved into Alsace-Lorraine with initial success, briefly occupying the city of Mulhouse. However, this advance was short-lived, and the French soon found themselves retreating in what became known as the Battle of the Frontiers. During these opening weeks, the armies moved across the landscape in their bright uniforms, French soldiers in their distinctive red trousers and blue coats, German troops in field gray, as the last remnants of 19th-century warfare gradually gave way to the harsh realities of modern combat. The British Expeditionary Force, led by Field Marshal Sir John French, made contact with German forces at Mons in Belgium on August 23rd. The professional British soldiers, well trained in rapid rifle fire, initially held their ground effectively, causing significant German casualties. However, the overwhelming numbers of the German forces eventually compelled the British to begin a long, exhausting retreat alongside their French allies. This retreat continued until early September, with the Allied forces moving steadily southward through the French countryside. The soldiers marched through warm summer days, their boots worn from countless miles, their uniforms covered in dust from the French roads. Local civilians watched with growing concern as the Allied armies passed through their towns and villages, heading ever closer to Paris. The tide began to turn at the Battle of the Marne, which took place from September 5th to September 12th. French General Joseph Joffre orchestrated a counterattack, using Paris taxis to transport troops to the front in what became known as the Miracle of the Marne. The German advance was finally halted, and both sides began to dig the first trenches that would eventually stretch from the Swiss border to the North Sea. These initial battles demonstrated the devastating effect of modern weaponry, particularly artillery and machine guns. The casualties were staggering. Tens of thousands of men fell in single days of fighting. The pastoral landscapes of France and Belgium were transformed by shell craters, while once peaceful villages became battlegrounds. The sound of artillery fire became a constant backdrop to life near the front, and the evening skies were illuminated by signal flares and explosions. As autumn approached, both sides began to realize that the war would not be over quickly, as the mobile warfare of the opening months gave way to an increasingly static and entrenched conflict that would define the Western Front for years to come. While the Western Front descended into trench warfare, equally momentous events were unfolding in the East, where vast armies clashed across the sprawling plains and forests between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. The Eastern Front of World War I would become a theater of operations stretching over 1,600 kilometers, from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. In August 1914, the Russian Empire mobilized its forces more quickly than the Germans had anticipated. Two Russian armies, led by Generals Pavel Rennenkampf and Alexander Samsonov, advanced into East Prussia. The German Eighth Army, though outnumbered, was commanded by the skilled duo of Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff. In the warm summer air, amid the gentle whisper of pine forests, these massive forces converged near the Masurian Lakes. The resulting Battle of Tannenberg, fought between August 26 and 30, 1914, became one of the most decisive engagements of the war. The Germans, using railway networks to maneuver their forces efficiently, encircled Samsonov's Second Army. In the quiet woods, the sounds of artillery fire echoed across the landscape as Russian soldiers found themselves trapped. The defeat was devastating for Russia, with nearly 92,000 captured and over 30,000 killed or wounded. General Samsonov, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the disaster, walked into the forest and took his own life. Meanwhile, to the south, Austria-Hungary's campaigns against Russia were facing severe difficulties. The Habsburg forces, advancing through Galicia, encountered fierce Russian resistance. The fighting swept across the fertile plains where peasants had recently harvested their crops. Throughout the autumn of 1914, the Austrians suffered a series of defeats, losing the important city of Lemberg, now Lviv, and much of Galicia. As winter approached, the Eastern Front settled into a different pattern from the West. Rather than static trench warfare, the vast spaces allowed for more fluid movements. Soldiers endured bitter cold, with temperatures dropping far below freezing. The sound of creaking wagon wheels and horses' hooves on frozen ground became familiar to troops on both sides as they maneuvered across the snowy landscape. The human cost was immense. In the Russian armies, many soldiers lacked proper winter clothing and basic equipment. Their boots wore out on long marches across the expansive terrain, and supplies often failed to reach the front lines. In the Austrian forces, ethnic tensions simmered as troops from various parts of the multi-ethnic empire fought side by side, their breath visible in the cold air as they huddled around campfires at night. These early campaigns on the Eastern Front would set the stage for years of brutal fighting, ultimately contributing to the collapse of three empires, Russian, German, and Austro-Hungarian, and reshaping the map of Eastern Europe forever. As the war spread across land in Europe, another crucial theater of conflict was emerging on the seas. The naval arms race between Britain and Germany that had preceded the war now transformed into actual combat, with the mighty British Royal Navy facing off against the ambitious German High Seas Fleet in a contest that would shape the course of the conflict. In the warm August days of 1914, Britain's Grand Fleet, commanded by Admiral John Jellicoe, began implementing a distant blockade of Germany. British warships patrolled the North Sea in a gentle but firm presence, their gray hulls cutting through the waves as they sought to prevent supplies from reaching German ports. The sound of steam engines and the sight of smoke on the horizon became familiar to sailors of both nations. The first significant naval engagement came on August 28, 1914, in the Battle of Helgoland Bight. British cruisers and destroyers ventured close to the German coast, where the morning mist shrouded the waters. The resulting battle saw three German light cruisers sunk, their crews struggling in the cold waters until rescue arrived. This early British victory helped establish a pattern of naval warfare that would persist throughout much of the conflict. Meanwhile, German U-boats began their operations in the Atlantic, marking the beginning of submarine warfare that would revolutionize naval combat. These underwater vessels, cramped and dangerous for their crews, prowled silently beneath the waves. The submariners lived in close quarters, surrounded by the constant hum of engines and the smell of diesel fuel, watching through periscopes for potential targets. The German Navy also deployed surface raiders like the SMS Emden, which captured or sank numerous Allied merchant vessels in the Indian Ocean. Captain Karl von Müller, commanding the Emden, became known for his chivalrous treatment of captured crews, often ensuring their safety before destroying their vessels. The quiet efficiency of these commerce raiders caused significant concern for Allied shipping. By late 1914, the pattern of naval warfare had been established. The British Grand Fleet maintained its strategic blockade, while German forces sought opportunities for smaller engagements and commerce raiding. In harbors and ports, the sounds of shipbuilding continued day and night as both sides expanded their fleets. Sailors adjusted to new routines of constant vigilance, watching the horizons for enemy vessels while dealing with the monotony of extended patrols. The naval war would soon evolve further, with new technologies and tactics emerging as both sides sought advantage. The gentle lapping of waves against steel hulls belied the tension that filled every moment at sea, as the great navies of Europe engaged in a complex dance of strategy and survival that would continue throughout the war. As 1915 dawned across the frozen battlefields of Europe, the nature of warfare was about to change dramatically. The initial hopes of a quick victory had faded into the harsh reality of stalemate, as armies on both sides found themselves entrenched in elaborate systems of fortification stretching hundreds of miles. The Western Front had become a vast network of trenches, extending from the North Sea to the Swiss border, where soldiers endured the daily challenges of life in these muddy channels carved into the earth. In this new form of warfare, The space between opposing trenches became known as no man's land, a barren stretch of crater-pocked earth, tangled with barbed wire and haunted by the remains of failed attacks. The soft sounds of rainfall would mix with the distant rumble of artillery as soldiers huddled in their dugouts, trying to find moments of rest between the periods of intense combat. The year 1915 saw the introduction of new weapons that would forever change the face of battle. In April, near the Belgian town of Ypres, German forces released clouds of chlorine gas, marking the first large-scale use of chemical weapons in modern warfare. The yellow-green clouds drifted slowly across no man's land, bringing with them a new kind of terror to the battlefield. Allied soldiers, unprepared for this new threat, found themselves gasping for breath as the poisonous vapors filled their lungs. The development of warfare technology continued throughout the year. The humble hand grenade evolved into a more sophisticated weapon, while mortars became increasingly important for trench warfare. Underground warfare also emerged, with both sides engaging in tunneling operations to plant explosive charges beneath enemy positions. The quiet darkness beneath the battlefield became another frontier of combat, where miners listened intently for the sounds of enemy digging. Above the trenches, aircraft began to play a more significant role. What had started as simple reconnaissance missions evolved into aerial combat, as pilots engaged in dogfights using aircraft increasingly equipped with machine guns. The skies above the battlefield became another theater of war, where young aviators in their canvas and wood machines dueled in the clouds. Throughout this period, military leaders struggled to adapt their strategies to this new reality. Traditional tactics of mass infantry attacks proved catastrophically costly against modern defensive weapons. The machine gun, in particular, demonstrated its devastating effectiveness, capable of cutting down waves of attacking soldiers. The quiet afternoons would often be shattered by the rattling of these weapons, their sound becoming an all-too-familiar part of the soldier's daily existence. As the year progressed, both sides searched for ways to break the deadlock, leading to the development of new tactical approaches and technologies that would influence military thinking for decades to come. The war had entered a new phase, one that would require unprecedented levels of industrial production and human endurance to sustain. As the war settled into stalemate along the Western Front, a new form of warfare emerged that would come to define the Great War, the intricate system of trenches stretching across the European landscape. Let us explore how these elaborate defensive networks developed and transformed the nature of combat. The first trenches began as simple shallow ditches, hastily dug by soldiers seeking protection from enemy fire. As autumn turned to winter in 1914, these basic shelters gradually evolved into an extensive network of defensive positions. The trenches deepened and widened, reinforced with wooden boards, sandbags, and sheets of corrugated iron. They took on a distinctive zigzag pattern, designed to prevent enemy fire from traveling down long straight sections and to limit the impact of artillery blasts. A typical trench system consisted of 3 parallel lines. The front line, where soldiers would stand watch and launch attacks, connected to a support trench several dozen yards behind, which housed more troops and supplies. Further back still lay the reserve trench, where units could rest and reorganize. These main trenches were joined by communication trenches that allowed for the movement of troops, ammunition, and messages between the lines. Life in the trenches followed a quiet rhythm punctuated by moments of intense activity. Soldiers would rotate through different positions, typically spending 4 days in the front line, 4 days in support, 4 days in reserve, and 4 days resting behind the lines. The daily routine involved dawn and dusk, stand-to periods when attacks were most likely, interspersed with maintenance work, sentry duty, and precious moments of rest. The environment within the trenches was challenging in ways that went beyond the constant threat of enemy fire. The chalk soil of northern France and Belgium, combined with frequent rainfall, created a perpetual muddy morass. Wooden duckboards laid along trench floors provided somewhat stable footing, while drainage systems attempted to manage the water level, though often with limited success. Disease and discomfort became constant companions. Trench foot, caused by prolonged exposure to cold and wet conditions, could lead to gangrene if untreated. Rats thrived in the trenches, feeding on discarded food and more grimly on the bodies of fallen soldiers. Lice infested clothing and bedding, spreading trench fever among the troops. The air carried the persistent smell of unwashed bodies, latrine waste, and cordite from shell explosions. Between the opposing trench lines lay no man's land, a desolate stretch of crater-pocked earth tangled with barbed wire. This barrier proved nearly impossible to cross under fire, leading to the development of new tactical approaches. Night raids became common, with small parties venturing out to gather intelligence or capture prisoners. The art of camouflage evolved, as did techniques for cutting through barbed wire and navigating in darkness. As the war settled into its grinding pattern of trench warfare, military leaders on both sides sought new ways to break the deadlock, leading to unprecedented innovations in weaponry and combat tactics. The peaceful evening air would soon be filled with the soft mechanical whirring of new machines of war, forever changing the nature of combat. Among the most significant developments was the introduction of poison gas. On April 22, 1915, at the Second Battle of Ypres, German forces released clouds of chlorine gas that drifted gently across no man's land, causing Allied troops to flee in panic as the yellowish-green clouds brought suffering and death. The sight of soldiers gasping for breath through cloth masks would become all too common, as both sides began deploying various chemical weapons, including mustard gas, which left invisible burns on exposed skin. The tank, first introduced by the British at the Battle of the Somme in 1916, emerged from the morning mist like a lumbering steel beast. These early Mark I tanks, though slow and unreliable, created an eerie psychological impact as they crawled across the battlefield at walking pace, crushing barbed wire and crossing trenches. The quiet rumble of their engines brought both hope and fear to those who witnessed them. In the skies above, aviation technology progressed from fragile reconnaissance aircraft to increasingly sophisticated fighting machines. The gentle flutter of canvas wings gave way to the steady drone of more powerful engines, as aircraft like the German Fokker EII and the Allied Sopwith Camel engaged in graceful yet deadly aerial ballet. Pilots developed new tactics for air combat, learning to approach from the sun and master the art of deflection shooting. The humble hand grenade evolved into various specialized forms, including the German stick grenade nicknamed the potato masher. Soldiers would hear the soft metallic click of the fuse, followed by a few seconds of tense silence before detonation. Mortars, too, became increasingly sophisticated, allowing troops to rain down explosives on enemy positions from the relative safety of their trenches. Underground warfare took on new significance as mining companies dug elaborate tunnel systems beneath enemy lines. In the darkness below, soldiers would work in complete silence, listening intently for the faint sounds of enemy tunnelers, knowing that massive explosive charges could be detonated at any moment. The development of steel helmets, first introduced by the French in 1915, provided essential protection against the constant danger of shell fragments. The familiar silhouette of the helmet-wearing soldier became a defining image of the war, as troops adjusted to wearing these new protective devices that would save countless lives throughout the conflict. These innovations in warfare technology and tactics would leave an indelible mark on military strategy, setting patterns that would influence combat operations for decades to come. The quiet fields of Europe had become testing grounds for weapons that would reshape the very nature of human conflict. As the war ground into stalemate, military leaders sought new ways to break through enemy defenses, leading to one of the most horrific innovations of World War I: chemical warfare. On April 22, 1915, Near the Belgian town of Ypres, German forces released over 150 tons of chlorine gas across a 4-mile front. As the greenish-yellow cloud drifted toward Allied trenches, soldiers watched in confusion and growing terror as the mysterious vapor approached. The effects were devastating. The chlorine gas burned eyes and throats, filled lungs with fluid, and caused terrible suffering. French colonial troops, caught completely unprepared, fled in panic as thousands choked and gasped for air. The Germans, perhaps themselves surprised by the weapon's effectiveness, advanced cautiously into the gap but failed to fully exploit their advantage. This first major use of chemical weapons marked a turning point, opening a new chapter in modern warfare. Soon, both sides began developing and deploying various chemical agents. The British responded with their own chlorine attacks at Loos in September 1915. Scientists worked to create more lethal compounds like phosgene and mustard gas, while military planners devised new delivery methods using artillery shells rather than simple release from cylinders. Soldiers adapted as best they could to this invisible threat. Early improvised protections included cloth masks soaked in urine, which provided some defense against chlorine. Gradually, more effective gas masks were developed and became standard equipment, though they were hot, restrictive, and difficult to wear for long periods. The distinctive smell of mustard gas, like garlic or horseradish, became a dreaded warning sign in the trenches. The psychological impact of chemical weapons was profound. Unlike bullets or shells, gas created a deep, primal fear. It could seep into dugouts and trenches, forcing soldiers to either don uncomfortable masks or risk terrible injury. The effects could be horrifically lasting. Survivors often suffered respiratory problems for years afterward. The wind could blow gas clouds back onto the attacking forces, making it an unpredictable weapon that soldiers on both sides feared and despised. Despite causing relatively few deaths compared to conventional weapons, about 90,000 fatalities out of 1.3 million gas casualties, chemical warfare left an indelible mark on the collective memory of the war. The sight of soldiers choking and blindly stumbling through gas clouds became one of the conflict's most powerful and disturbing images, symbolizing the war's descent into previously unimaginable forms of industrialized killing. As 1915 dawned, military leaders on both sides of the conflict began to realize that the war would not be won through quick victories or decisive battles. Instead, a new and grinding phase of warfare emerged, the war of attrition. This methodical approach focused on gradually wearing down the enemy's resources, manpower, and will to fight through sustained pressure and continuous operations. In the quiet moments between battles, commanders calculated their losses with cold precision. Each side believed they could outlast the other, drawing upon their nation's industrial capacity, population, and economic strength. The Western Front settled into a somber rhythm of artillery barrages, raids and counter-raids, while soldiers endured the constant strain of vigilance in the trenches. General Erich von Falkenhayn, the German chief of staff, explicitly embraced this strategy at Verdun in early 1916, aiming to bleed France white through sustained combat operations. The French would be forced to defend this symbolically important fortress city, and in doing so, would sacrifice their army's strength in what Falkenhayn called his meat grinder. Along the entire front, the pattern of attrition warfare became evident in the daily routines of soldiers. Artillery fire would begin at dawn, followed by probing attacks and counterattacks. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles, bringing endless streams of ammunition, replacement troops, and materials to the front. Behind the lines, factories worked around the clock, women took up industrial jobs, and entire societies reorganized themselves to sustain this unprecedented level of military effort. The human cost mounted steadily. The British Army lost 60,000 men on a single day during the Battle of the Somme. The French Army suffered 350,000 casualties defending Verdun. German losses matched these numbers, as month after month, young men marched to the front and casualties returned home. In the quiet villages behind the lines, hospitals filled with wounded soldiers, and families received telegrams bearing news of losses with increasing frequency. The war of attrition extended beyond the battlefield. Naval blockades slowly tightened their grip, affecting civilian populations through food shortages and economic hardship. Germany's submarine campaign targeted Allied shipping, while the British blockade gradually reduced German access to vital raw materials. In cities across Europe, civilians adapted to rationing, shortages, and the steady drain of resources toward the war effort. As 1916 progressed, the grinding nature of attrition warfare became increasingly apparent. Military planners spoke of acceptable losses and wastage rates, while soldiers in the trenches developed a fatalistic acceptance of their role in this industrial-scale conflict. The war had evolved into a test of endurance, where victory would belong not to the side with the cleverer tactics or braver soldiers, but to the nation that could sustain the longest effort and absorb the greatest losses. As the war entered 1915, what had begun as a primarily European conflict began to expand dramatically across the globe. Like ripples spreading across still water, the effects of the Great War reached ever further, drawing in new nations and peoples into its widening embrace. In the warm Mediterranean spring of 1915, Italy made the momentous decision to enter the war on the side of the Allies, breaking its earlier alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary. The Italian front opened along the Alpine borders, where soldiers would soon face not only enemy fire, but also the harsh conditions of mountain warfare, with avalanches and freezing temperatures claiming many lives in the quiet hours of night. Further east, Bulgaria joined the Central Powers in September 1915, allowing German forces to establish a continuous land route from Berlin to Constantinople. The Bulgarian army, still fresh and well-equipped, helped overwhelm Serbia in a joint campaign with Austrian and German forces. As autumn leaves fell across the Balkans, thousands of Serbian soldiers and civilians retreated through the snow-covered Albanian mountains, seeking refuge on the Adriatic coast. The war's expansion brought new fronts and new challenges. In the distant sands of Mesopotamia, British and Indian forces advanced up the Tigris River toward Baghdad, while in East Africa, British colonial troops engaged German forces, led by the resourceful Colonel Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck. The soft rustling of palm fronds and the gentle African breezes carried the sounds of conflict to lands far from the Western Front. Throughout 1916, the war continued its inexorable spread. Portugal, having historically maintained an alliance with Britain, officially entered the conflict in March. Romanian troops would join the Allied cause in August, though their intervention would prove costly as Central Power forces quickly occupied much of their territory. The expansion of the war brought new technologies and tactics to diverse battlefields. Submarines prowled the Mediterranean waters, while aircraft began appearing over the deserts of the Middle East. In the colonies, centuries-old fortifications faced modern artillery, and traditional cavalry units encountered machine guns in unfamiliar terrain. As the conflict grew, so too did its impact on civilian life. Supply lines stretched across oceans and continents, bringing goods and materials from increasingly distant lands. The quiet hours of evening in cities from Cairo to Calcutta were filled with discussions of far-off battles and concerns about loved ones serving in distant lands. This expansion transformed what had begun as a European war into truly a world war, weaving together the fates of peoples across continents and oceans. The gentle night winds carried tales of battle and sacrifice from the Alps to the African plains, from the Persian Gulf to the Pacific Islands, as humanity entered an unprecedented era of global conflict. As the war expanded across Europe in 1915, Italy found itself in a unique and delicate position. Though formally allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary through the Triple Alliance since 1882, Italy had maintained neutrality when the conflict began. In the quiet diplomatic chambers of European capitals, representatives from both the Allied and Central Powers courted Italy's favor, understanding the strategic importance of this Mediterranean nation. The Italian people were divided in their sentiments. In the cafes and piazzas of Rome and Milan, passionate debates unfolded between the neutralists, who wished to maintain peace, and the interventionists, who saw an opportunity to fulfill long-held territorial ambitions. The gentle breezes carrying the scent of orange blossoms and coffee through Italian streets also carried whispers of potential territorial gains. The predominantly Italian-speaking regions of Trentino, South Tyrol, and Trieste, all then under Austrian control. In April 1915, after months of careful negotiation, Italy signed the secret Treaty of London with the Allied powers. The agreement promised Italy significant territorial concessions in exchange for entering the war on the Allied side. The soft rustling of paper as diplomats signed these documents would soon give way to the thunderous sounds of artillery along a new front. On May 23, 1915, Italy formally declared war on Austria-Hungary. The declaration was delivered in Vienna as spring flowers bloomed in the imperial gardens. Italian soldiers, their green-gray uniforms fresh and clean, began mobilizing along the northeastern frontier. They would soon face the harsh reality of mountain warfare in the Alps, where the peaceful snow-covered peaks would become battlegrounds. Under the leadership of General Luigi Cadorna, the Italian army launched its first offensive against Austrian positions along the Isonzo River. The clear waters of the Isonzo, which had for centuries flowed peacefully through the Julian Alps, would witness 11 major battles between 1915 and 1917. Italian troops struggled to advance across the rocky terrain, their boots wearing thin on the limestone outcrops, their breath visible in the cool mountain air. The fighting in this theater took on a character distinct from the Western Front. Instead of flat fields and trenches, soldiers contended with vertical cliff faces and narrow mountain passes. They fought not only against enemy forces, but against the elements themselves. Avalanches, extreme cold, and treacherous terrain claimed many lives. In the quiet evening hours, soldiers huddled in mountain dugouts could hear the distant echoes of falling rocks and occasional gunfire, while gazing at the same stars that had guided shepherds through these passes for generations. The entry of Italy into the conflict marked another significant expansion of the Great War, drawing more resources, more men, and more nations into its ever-widening scope. The peaceful Mediterranean nation that had once been a destination for artists and travelers had transformed into another battlefield in humanity's greatest conflict. As the war expanded beyond the Western Front in 1915, Allied planners turned their attention to a bold but ultimately ill-fated campaign in the Dardanelles Strait. This narrow waterway, connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Black Sea through Turkish territory, became the site of one of the most poignant and costly campaigns of the Great War, the Gallipoli Campaign. In the quiet early months of 1915, First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill proposed a naval operation to force passage through the Dardanelles, hoping to establish a supply route to Russia and potentially knock Ottoman Turkey out of the war. The gentle waters of the strait, flowing between ancient shores, would soon become witness to tremendous human sacrifice. The campaign began on February 19, 1915, as Allied ships slowly approached the narrow passage. The sound of heavy naval guns echoed across the water as British and French warships attempted to silence the Turkish shore batteries. Despite initial optimism, the naval assault faced unexpected challenges. The waters of the strait had been carefully mined by the Turks, and on March 18, 3 Allied battleships were lost to these hidden dangers beneath the peaceful-looking surface. Following the naval setback, Allied forces prepared for an amphibious landing. On April 25, 1915, troops from Britain, France, and most notably, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps ANZAC, came ashore along the Gallipoli Peninsula. The landing beaches, now forever etched in history, were met with fierce Turkish resistance under the capable leadership of Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk. The campaign settled into a pattern of grinding warfare amid the peninsula's harsh terrain. Soldiers on both sides endured extreme conditions, the scorching summer heat, winter storms, and diseases that spread through crowded trenches. The sound of gunfire mixed with the persistent buzz of flies, while the scent of thyme growing wild on the hills mingled with less pleasant aromas of warfare. Through the long months of stalemate, countless acts of bravery and sacrifice occurred on both sides. The Turkish defenders, well positioned on the high ground, successfully contained the Allied forces on their narrow beachheads. Despite several attempts to break out, including the August offensive at Suvla Bay, the campaign made little progress. As autumn turned to winter, and with no breakthrough in sight, evacuation plans were carefully developed. In December 1915 and January 1916, Allied forces quietly withdrew from the peninsula under cover of darkness. The operation, perhaps the most successful part of the campaign, was conducted without a single casualty, as soldiers silently left their positions, their boots muffled to maintain secrecy. The Gallipoli campaign had lasting repercussions, contributing to Churchill's temporary political decline and profoundly impacting the national consciousness of Australia, New Zealand, and Turkey. The shores where so many young lives were lost would become places of pilgrimage and remembrance, where the gentle Mediterranean waves continue to lap at beaches once contested so fiercely. As the Great War expanded beyond European battlefields, the Middle Eastern theater emerged as a crucial arena of conflict, where ancient empires and modern ambitions collided in the desert sands. The Ottoman Empire, which had ruled much of the region for centuries, aligned itself with Germany and Austria-Hungary, drawing the Middle East into the global struggle. In the warm desert air of Mesopotamia, British forces advanced from their bases in the Persian Gulf, seeking to protect vital oil fields and challenge Ottoman control. The campaign began in November 1914, with British Indian troops moving steadily northward along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, their boots crunching on the dry earth as they marched through the cradle of civilization. The initial success of the British forces led to overconfidence. In 1915, General Charles Townshend led his troops toward Baghdad, but the advance proved ill-fated. The Ottomans, under the skilled German General Kalmar von der Goltz, surrounded the British force at Kut al-Amara. Through the cold winter months, from December 1915 to April 1916, the trapped soldiers endured hunger and disease before finally surrendering in what became one of Britain's most humiliating defeats of the war. Meanwhile, in the Arabian Peninsula, a different kind of warfare was taking shape. British intelligence officer T.E. Lawrence, who would become known as Lawrence of Arabia, worked to foster Arab rebellion against Ottoman rule. The sound of hoofbeats across the desert marked the beginning of a guerrilla campaign that would capture the world's imagination. Working with Sheriff Hussein of Mecca and his sons, particularly Faisal, Lawrence helped coordinate attacks on Ottoman railways and outposts. In Palestine, British forces under General Edmund Allenby advanced northward from Egypt. The campaign moved at a measured pace, with careful consideration given to securing water sources and supply lines in the challenging desert environment. The capture of Jerusalem in December 1917 marked a significant symbolic victory, as Allenby entered the Holy City on foot through the Jaffa Gate, respectfully removing his hat. The war in the Middle East was characterized by extreme conditions, scorching heat during the day, bitter cold at night, and the constant challenge of maintaining supplies across vast desert expanses. Soldiers from both sides endured sandstorms, water shortages, and diseases that spread rapidly in the harsh environment. As the conflict progressed, the British and French made secret agreements about the post-war division of Ottoman territories, most notably in the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916. These diplomatic maneuvers would have lasting consequences for the region, drawing new borders and creating new nations whose effects continue to resonate today. The gentle whisper of shifting sands seemed to echo the changing tides of power in this ancient land. While the main theaters of World War I were in Europe, significant campaigns also took place across the African continent, where European colonial powers vied for control of territories and resources. As we drift into this often overlooked aspect of the Great War, let us explore the complex tapestry of conflict that unfolded across Africa's diverse landscapes. In East Africa, the German colonial forces, led by the resourceful Colonel Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, conducted one of the most remarkable campaigns of the war. With a small but effective force of German officers and African Askari soldiers, von Lettow-Vorbeck engaged in a prolonged guerrilla campaign that would last the entire duration of the war. Moving through the thick forests and across the savannas, his forces consistently evaded larger British, Belgian, and Portuguese forces while conducting raids and disrupting Allied operations. The campaign in German Southwest Africa, modern-day Namibia, unfolded quite differently. Here, South African forces under Louis Botha, representing British interests, launched a methodical campaign against German colonial troops. The harsh desert environment with its scorching days and cold nights proved as challenging as the enemy forces. By July 1915, the German forces in Southwest Africa surrendered, marking one of the earliest Allied victories of the war. In German Cameroon, a joint Anglo-French force slowly advanced through dense jungle terrain, facing not only German resistance, but also the challenges of tropical diseases and difficult supply lines. The campaign began in August 1914 and continued until early 1916, when the last German forces retreated into neutral Spanish Guinea. Perhaps less known were the operations in Togoland, where British and French forces quickly overwhelmed the German defenders in August 1914. The wireless station at Kamina, vital for coordinating German naval operations in the Atlantic, was captured and destroyed, marking an early strategic victory for the Allies. Throughout these campaigns, African soldiers and carriers played crucial roles, though their contributions were often overlooked in historical accounts. Over 1 million African troops and laborers supported the war effort, carrying supplies through difficult terrain, serving as combat troops, and maintaining vital supply lines. The war brought significant changes to African societies. Traditional power structures were disrupted, new economic patterns emerged, and the movement of troops and laborers spread both ideas and diseases across the continent. The influenza pandemic of 1918 would find particularly fertile ground among populations weakened by the war's privations. As we reflect on these African campaigns, we can appreciate how they represented a complex intersection of colonial ambitions, military innovation, and human endurance. The consequences of these campaigns would continue to influence African societies long after the war's end, contributing to the gradual transformation of colonial relationships and the eventual emergence of independent African nations. As 1916 dawned across the war-torn landscapes of Europe, several monumental battles would unfold that would shape the course of the Great War. Let us drift back to those fateful months, when the sound of artillery fire echoed across muddy fields and through dense forests. The year began with the Germans launching a massive assault on the French fortress city of Verdun in February. The peaceful winter morning was shattered as thousands of German artillery pieces opened fire in what would become the longest battle of the entire war. General Erich von Falkenhayn, the German chief of staff, believed he could bleed France white at Verdun, choosing this target for its historic significance to the French nation. Through the spring and summer, French and German soldiers fought back and forth over a small patch of ground, their boots sinking into mud mixed with blood. The battle centered around a series of forts, with Fort Douaumont and Fort Vaux becoming symbols of incredible endurance. The French commander, Philippe Pétain, organized a rotating system of troops, declaring they shall not pass, ils ne passeront pas, which became a rallying cry. As Verdun continued to consume lives and resources, the British and French launched their own major offensive along the River Somme on July 1, 1916. The morning air was still and heavy as British soldiers climbed out of their trenches, many walking slowly toward the German lines. The peaceful summer scene was tragically deceptive. By day's end, the British Army suffered its worst single-day casualties in history, with nearly 20,000 killed. The Battle of the Somme continued through the warm days of summer and into the crisp autumn air. Here, tanks made their first appearance in warfare, lumbering metal creatures that crawled across the scarred landscape. Though they often broke down, their psychological impact was significant. The battle ground on until November, claiming over 1 million casualties on all sides. In the east, Russian General Alexei Brusilov launched a surprisingly successful offensive against Austro-Hungarian forces in June. The careful preparation and innovative tactics brought significant gains, though the success could not be fully exploited due to lacking resources and coordination. As winter approached once again, the great battles of 1916 finally wound down. Verdun had claimed over 700,000 casualties by its end in December. The landscape was forever changed. Shell holes, trenches, and debris would remain visible for decades to come. The year's battles had demonstrated both the terrible destructive power of industrial warfare and the remarkable endurance of the human spirit. Through it all, soldiers on all sides found moments of quiet humanity, sharing cigarettes during informal truces, writing letters home by candlelight, and finding comfort in simple companionship amid the chaos of war. As the year 1916 unfolded, one of the most devastating battles in human history would take place at Verdun, a historic fortress town in northeastern France. The German Chief of Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, had conceived a strategy he called Bleeding France White, selecting Verdun for its symbolic importance to French national pride and its strategic position on the Western Front. On a cold February morning in 1916, the battle began with an unprecedented artillery bombardment. For 10 hours, German guns fired nearly 1 million shells across a relatively small sector of the front. The sound of the barrage could be heard hundreds of kilometers away, echoing across the frost-covered landscape like rolling thunder. Through the mist and smoke, French soldiers in their distinctive horizon blue uniforms waited in their trenches, knowing that the German attack was imminent. The battle would continue for 303 days, becoming what French soldiers called the Hell of Verdun. The landscape transformed into a moonscape of shell craters, splintered trees, and mud. The once verdant hills around Verdun became known by grim names: Dead Man's Hill, Fort WW1, Fort Vaux, places where thousands of men would fight and die over mere meters of ground. General Philippe Pétain organized the French defense, implementing a rotation system where divisions would serve a few days at the front before being relieved. His famous order, "They shall not pass," "Ils ne passeront pas," became a rallying cry for the French army. Along the Sacred Way, the single road that connected Verdun to the rear, an endless stream of trucks moved day and night, bringing supplies forward and carrying wounded men back. The fighting continued through spring and summer, through autumn rains and early winter snow. Soldiers on both sides endured unimaginable conditions: constant artillery fire, poison gas, disease, and the psychological strain of sustained combat. The air was thick with the acrid smell of cordite, while the ground became a quagmire of mud mixed with blood and broken equipment. By December 1916, when the battle finally ended, the human cost was staggering. Nearly 800,000 casualties were recorded between both sides. The French had held Verdun, but the price was almost beyond comprehension. The battle became a symbol of endurance and sacrifice, particularly for the French nation, while also highlighting the futility of attritional warfare. The fields around Verdun still bear the scars of this terrible battle. Beneath the peaceful forests that have grown since, thousands of unexploded shells remain buried, and the ossuaries hold the remains of countless unidentified soldiers who gave their lives in this crucial chapter of the Great War. Verdun would forever stand as a testament to both the determination and the tragedy of industrial warfare in the modern age. As the brutal Battle of Verdun continued to rage, another devastating offensive was taking shape along the River Somme in northern France. On July 1, 1916, after 7 days of intense artillery bombardment, British and French forces launched what would become one of the bloodiest battles in human history. The gentle rolling countryside of the Somme region, with its peaceful farming villages and ancient woodlands, would soon be transformed into a scarred wasteland. The British commander, General Douglas Haig, had carefully planned this offensive, believing it would finally break through the German lines. As dawn broke on that summer morning, thousands of soldiers emerged from their trenches, walking steadily across the dew-covered fields toward the German positions. The morning mist hung low over the landscape as birds continued their songs, unaware of the impending chaos. What followed was beyond imagination. The preliminary bombardment had failed to destroy the German defenses and their machine gun positions. As the British troops advanced in ordered lines, German machine guns opened fire from their concrete bunkers. By the end of that first day alone, the British Army suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, including almost 20,000 dead, the worst single-day losses in British military history. The battle continued through the warm summer months and into the cold, wet autumn. New weapons made their appearance, including the first British tanks, which rumbled across the muddy battlefield in September. The sound of their engines and crushing treads added to the constant symphony of artillery fire and exploding shells that echoed across the scarred landscape. Villages like Thiepval, Pozières, and Courcelette became synonymous with sacrifice and suffering. The once fertile fields turned into a maze of mud-filled craters and splintered trees. Soldiers on both sides endured conditions that challenged their very humanity, living in waterlogged trenches, surrounded by the ever-present sight and smell of death. By the time the offensive finally ended in November 1916, after 141 days of continuous fighting, the Allied forces had advanced only 7 miles at the deepest point. The human cost was staggering: more than 400,000 British, 200,000 French, and 500,000 German casualties. The battle had consumed an entire generation of young men from towns and villages across Britain, France, and Germany. The Battle of the Somme marked a turning point in how war was perceived. The scale of losses and the industrial nature of the conflict forever changed the way people thought about warfare. The peaceful countryside would eventually heal, but the memory of those summer months in 1916 would remain forever etched in the collective consciousness of the nations involved. As the battles of Verdun and the Somme raged on the Western Front in 1916, another significant offensive was taking shape in the east. The Brusilov Offensive, named after Russian General Alexei Brusilov, would become one of the most successful Allied operations of World War I, though its story often drifts quietly through the shadows of history like autumn leaves on a gentle breeze. In the warm days of June 1916, General Brusilov carefully prepared his forces along a 300-mile front facing the Austro-Hungarian armies. Unlike the thunderous, concentrated attacks common on the Western Front, Brusilov planned something different: a series of coordinated strikes across a broad front, like ripples spreading across a still pond. The offensive began on June 4th, opening with a relatively brief artillery bombardment that lasted only hours rather than days. This departure from conventional wisdom caught the Austro-Hungarian forces by surprise. Brusilov's innovative tactics included careful reconnaissance and the training of specialized shock troops who would probe for weak points in the enemy lines, much like water finding its way through cracks in a stone wall. The Russian forces advanced steadily, moving through the gentle rolling hills and forests of Galicia and Bukovina. They captured the important city of Lutsk within 3 days, and by the end of June, they had taken Chernovitz as well. The Austro-Hungarian army began to crumble under the pressure, like a sandcastle slowly eroding against the tide. The human cost of the offensive was immense, though it unfolded with a different rhythm than the industrial slaughter of the Western Front. The Russians suffered around 500,000 casualties, while the Central Powers lost nearly 1.5 million men. Among these were many Czech and Slovak soldiers who surrendered willingly to their fellow Slavs, their stories weaving into the broader tapestry of ethnic tensions within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The success of the Brusilov offensive had far-reaching effects, like echoes carrying across a valley. It forced Germany to divert troops from Verdun, offering some relief to the French defenders. It also hastened the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian army, which would never fully recover its fighting capability. Romania, watching these events unfold like a cautious observer, was encouraged to enter the war on the Allied side in August 1916. Yet the offensive eventually slowed and stopped as summer faded into autumn. The Russian army, stretched thin by its advances and lacking the industrial capacity to sustain such operations, could not capitalize on its initial success. Like a river reaching its delta, the great push gradually dissipated into smaller, less effective actions. The Brusilov offensive would stand as both the greatest Russian victory of the war and, paradoxically, one of the last gasps of the Tsarist military, as the strains of war would soon contribute to revolution and profound change in Russian society. As the spring of 1916 unfolded across war-torn Europe, attention turned to the cold waters of the North Sea, where the greatest naval battle of World War I was about to unfold. The Battle of Jutland, known to the Germans as the Battle of Skagerrak, took place between May 31 and June 1, 1916, bringing together the two most powerful naval fleets in the world at that time. The British Grand Fleet, commanded by Admiral Sir John Jellicoe, had maintained a distant blockade of Germany throughout the war, while the German High Seas Fleet under Admiral Reinhard Scheer sought an opportunity to challenge British naval supremacy. The misty waters off the Danish peninsula of Jutland would become the stage for their inevitable confrontation. In the late afternoon of May 31, the scouting forces of both fleets made first contact. Vice Admiral Sir David Beattie's battlecruiser squadron encountered German ships under Vice Admiral Franz Hipper. The sound of massive naval guns echoed across the gray waters as these swift, powerful vessels exchanged fire. The air filled with the scent of cordite as shells weighing nearly a ton each arced through the sky. The initial phase of the battle proved costly for the British, as poor ammunition handling procedures led to the loss of two battlecruisers, HMS Indefatigable and HMS Queen Mary, which exploded spectacularly when German shells penetrated their armor. The crews of nearby ships watched in silent horror as their fellow sailors disappeared beneath the waves. As dusk approached, Admiral Scheer's main fleet arrived, followed by Jellicoe's Grand Fleet. The gathering darkness and misty conditions created an atmosphere of uncertainty as massive dreadnoughts maneuvered in the growing gloom. The sea itself seemed to glow with the flashes of hundreds of heavy guns firing in the twilight. Through the night, smaller engagements continued as destroyers and light cruisers clashed in the darkness. By morning, both fleets had disengaged, with the Germans successfully returning to their ports while the British maintained control of the North Sea. Though the Germans claimed a tactical victory, having sunk more British ships, the strategic victory belonged to Britain, as the German High Seas Fleet would never again seriously challenge British naval supremacy. The battle statistics tell a sobering tale. The British lost 14 ships and over 6,000 sailors, while the Germans lost 11 ships and over 2,500 men. The quiet waters of the North Sea became the final resting place for thousands of sailors from both nations, a somber reminder of the human cost of naval warfare in the industrial age. The Battle of Jutland demonstrated both the awesome power and the limitations of early 20th century naval warfare, while confirming Britain's crucial control of the seas, which would help ensure final Allied victory in the Great War. The lessons learned from this massive engagement would influence naval doctrine and ship design for decades to come. As the war stretched into its third year, it became increasingly clear that victory would depend not just on military might, but on the ability of nations to sustain their war efforts through resources and industrial production. The period of 1916 to 1917 saw the conflict transform into what historians would later call a total war, where the entire economic and industrial capacity of nations was directed toward the war effort. In Britain, the Ministry of Munitions, under David Lloyd George's leadership, steadily increased the production of shells, guns, and other war materiel. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking up positions in munitions factories, where they became known as munitionettes. Their skin would often turn yellow from handling TNT, earning them the nickname Canary Girls, as they worked long hours to keep the armies supplied. Germany, meanwhile, faced mounting challenges due to the British naval blockade. The German population endured what became known as the turnip winter of 1916–1917, when failed potato crops and food shortages led to widespread reliance on turnips as a dietary staple. The average daily caloric intake for German civilians dropped to about 1,000 calories, less than half of pre-war levels. The shortage of rubber, copper, and other raw materials began to affect military production. In response to these pressures, both sides sought to maximize their resource efficiency. The German government implemented the Hindenburg Program, a dramatic reorganization of the entire German economy for war production. This included the conscription of civilian workers and the streamlining of industrial processes. Similarly, France developed its own system of industrial mobilization, with the creation of the Ministry of Armaments under Albert Thomas. The Ottoman Empire, already struggling with limited industrialization, faced severe shortages of basic materials. The lack of coal for railway transportation particularly hampered their war effort, while their troops often went without adequate clothing and ammunition. Russia, despite its vast natural resources, struggled with transportation and distribution issues, leading to shortages in urban areas that would contribute to growing civil unrest. In the United States, still neutral but increasingly important as a supplier to the Allies, industrial production soared. American factories produced enormous quantities of weapons, ammunition, and other supplies, while American farms helped feed the Allied nations. This economic relationship would later influence America's entry into the war, as financial ties with the Allies grew stronger. The war of resources extended to the colonies as well, where raw materials like rubber from Southeast Asia, oil from the Middle East, and food supplies from India became crucial to the war effort. The management and transportation of these resources shaped military strategy and influenced the course of battles, as armies could only advance as far as their supply lines could sustain them. As the war of resources intensified, one of the most significant yet often overlooked aspects of World War I was the British naval blockade of Germany and its devastating effects on civilian life. The Royal Navy's control of the North Sea, established from the very beginning of the conflict in 1914, gradually tightened like a slowly constricting rope around the German economy and population. The blockade prevented not only military supplies, but also essential civilian goods from reaching German ports. Ships were carefully inspected at sea, and any vessels suspected of carrying cargo destined for Germany were diverted to British ports for thorough examination. The quiet persistence of this strategy would prove more decisive than many of the war's bloodiest battles. In the homes and streets of German cities, the effects of the blockade became increasingly apparent as the seasons passed. By 1916, the scarcity of basic foodstuffs led to the introduction of what became known as the turnip winter, when this humble root vegetable became a substitute for potatoes and other more nutritious foods. The gentle rustle of ration cards became a familiar sound in every household, as families carefully planned their meager allocations. The shortage of materials affected every aspect of daily life. Cotton and wool became so scarce that people began wearing clothes made from paper. The soft padding of newspapers was used to line shoes as leather became unavailable. In the quieter moments of evening, women would gather to unravel old sweaters and reknit the yarn into new garments, making every thread count. The blockade's effects reached far beyond immediate hunger. The lack of proper nutrition led to a gradual weakening of the population's health. Children grew up with vitamin deficiencies, their growth stunted by what doctors called blockade disease. The elderly, particularly vulnerable to the cold and hunger, suffered silently in their homes as coal and food became increasingly scarce. By 1917, the situation had become dire. Official statistics recorded a dramatic drop in the average German civilian's caloric intake, falling from about 3,000 calories per day in 1914 to just 1,500 calories by 1917. The smell of ersatz coffee, made from roasted acorns or chicory, wafted through city streets instead of real coffee. Bread, now made with sawdust to extend the flour, became a precious commodity. The psychological impact of the blockade was profound but subtle, wearing down the German population's morale like waves gradually eroding a shoreline. The constant presence of hunger and the endless search for food created a deep-seated resentment that would have lasting consequences for European history, contributing to the complex web of factors that would influence Germany's path in the decades to follow. As the British naval blockade tightened its grip on Germany, the Imperial German Navy developed its own strategy to counter Allied maritime dominance through the deployment of submarines, known as U-boats. These sleek underwater vessels, though relatively new to warfare, would come to transform naval combat and leave an indelible mark on the course of the Great War. In the calm waters of the Atlantic, German U-boats prowled silently beneath the waves, their periscopes barely breaking the surface as they searched for Allied merchant vessels and warships. The submarines, typically around 200 feet long and crewed by 35 men, operated in the confined space of their steel hulls, where the air grew thick with the scent of oil, sweat, and machinery. Initially, German submarine warfare followed the traditional prize rules of naval combat, where U-boats would surface, warn merchant ships, and allow crews to evacuate before sinking vessels. However, as the war intensified, Germany adopted a more aggressive approach. In February 1915, Kaiser Wilhelm II declared the waters around the British Isles a war zone, inaugurating a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. The most notorious incident of this campaign occurred on May 7, 1915, when the U-20, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Walter Schweiger, torpedoed the British passenger liner RMS Lusitania off the coast of Ireland. The ship sank in just 18 minutes, claiming 1,198 lives, including 128 Americans. The gentle waves of the Irish Sea became a scene of profound tragedy, as passengers struggled in the cold waters while rescue ships rushed to their aid. The sinking of the Lusitania caused international outrage, particularly in the United States, where public opinion began to shift against Germany. Pressure from neutral nations led Germany to temporarily restrict its submarine campaign in September 1915, but the demands of total war would eventually override diplomatic concerns. By 1917, German military leaders, particularly Admiral von Holzendorf, convinced the Kaiser that unrestricted submarine warfare could bring Britain to its knees within 6 months. The strategy seemed promising at first, as U-boats sank over 500,000 tons of shipping in February 1917 alone. Merchant sailors spoke in hushed tones of the terror of crossing the Atlantic, never knowing when a torpedo might emerge from the depths. However, the renewed submarine campaign had far-reaching consequences. The United States, provoked by the loss of American lives and ships, finally entered the war in April 1917. The Allies responded to the U-boat threat by implementing a convoy system, where merchant ships traveled in groups protected by warships. In the quiet hours before dawn, these convoys would gather in protected harbors, their crews watching nervously for the telltale wake of a periscope as they ventured into the open sea. As the war stretched on, nations faced the unprecedented challenge of mobilizing their entire societies for the war effort. The home front became just as crucial as the battlefront, transforming daily life in ways that would have been unimaginable before 1914. In Britain, the Ministry of Munitions, established in 1915 under David Lloyd George, orchestrated a massive reorganization of industry. Peaceful factories were quietly converted to produce shells, rifles, and other war materials. The gentle hum of textile looms gave way to the steady rhythm of machinery crafting ammunition. Women stepped into roles previously reserved for men, their hands now guiding industrial equipment instead of managing households. Across the Channel in France, the transformation was equally profound. The term guerre totale, total war, emerged to describe how every aspect of society became oriented toward the war effort. In places like Paris and Lyon, the streets that once bustled with café life now saw long queues for rationed bread and sugar. Gardens and parks were transformed into vegetable plots, their flowers replaced by rows of practical crops. Germany's experience of home front mobilization was particularly intense under the Hindenburg Program of 1916. Cities and towns witnessed the melting down of church bells for metal, while copper doorknobs and brass fixtures disappeared from homes, replaced by iron or wood. Children collected nettles and acorns in the countryside, contributing to the production of fabric and coffee substitutes. In all nations, propaganda became a gentle but persistent presence in daily life. Posters encouraged citizens to eat less, grow more food, and buy war bonds. The soft rustle of newspaper pages carried stories of sacrifice and patriotic duty. School children knitted socks and rolled bandages for soldiers, while their mothers preserved food and managed increasingly strict rations. The mobilization extended beyond material production. Women's organizations coordinated relief efforts, arranged care for wounded soldiers, and maintained morale through community activities. The quiet dedication of millions of civilians working in munitions factories, farms, and hospitals became as vital to the war effort as the soldiers in the trenches. This transformation of society had lasting effects that extended far beyond the war years. Traditional social structures began to shift, particularly regarding women's roles and labor relations. The experience of collective sacrifice and national organization would influence government policies and social expectations for decades to come, quietly reshaping the relationship between citizens and their states in ways that would echo through the remainder of the 20th century. The economic impact of World War I was profound and far-reaching, transforming not just the nations directly involved in the conflict, but reshaping the entire global financial system. As we drift back to those challenging years, we can observe how the peaceful pre-war economy gradually gave way to something entirely different. Before the war, London had been the world's financial center, with the British pound sterling serving as the primary international currency. The cost of the war, however, would slowly shift this balance. By 1917, Britain was spending roughly £6.5 million per day on the war effort, an almost unimaginable sum at the time. To finance these enormous expenditures, countries turned to various measures, including raising taxes, selling war bonds to their citizens, and borrowing heavily from abroad. The United States, initially neutral, became the primary lender to the Allied powers, particularly Britain and France. American banks, led by J.P. Morgan, provided crucial loans that helped sustain the Allied war effort. This financial role would gradually transform the United States from a debtor nation into the world's leading creditor, marking a significant shift in global economic power. In the quiet halls of government treasuries, officials grappled with mounting inflation as countries abandoned the gold standard to print more money. The cost of basic goods rose steadily, causing hardship for ordinary citizens. In Germany, where the naval blockade had severely restricted trade, the economy struggled particularly hard. By 1918, the German mark had lost much of its value, setting the stage for the hyperinflation that would follow in the post-war years. The war also accelerated industrial development and technological innovation. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking positions in factories and offices previously held by men. This transformation of the labor force would have lasting social and economic implications, quietly reshaping society even as the conflict raged on. Agricultural production shifted dramatically as well. Farmers struggled to maintain output with reduced manpower, while military demands for food created new pressures on agricultural systems. In many areas, government authorities began implementing food rationing and price controls, measures that would become increasingly common as the war progressed. The economic relationships between nations were permanently altered. Traditional trade patterns were disrupted, new industrial capabilities emerged, and economic nationalism began to rise. Japan and the United States particularly benefited, expanding their industrial capacity and establishing new trade relationships that would persist long after the war's end. As we contemplate these economic changes, we can imagine the anxiety of merchants watching their ledgers, farmers calculating their yields, and workers adapting to new roles in the industrial economy. These shifts would continue to influence global economic development well into the 20th century, leaving an indelible mark on the modern world. As the war entered its fourth year in 1917, several pivotal developments emerged that would fundamentally alter its course. The gentle winds of change began to blow across the battlefields of Europe, bringing with them new hopes, fears, and possibilities that would reshape the conflict's trajectory. In April 1917, after years of maintaining neutrality, the United States finally entered the war. President Woodrow Wilson's decision came in response to Germany's resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare and the revelation of the Zimmermann telegram, a secret diplomatic communication proposing a German alliance with Mexico. The steady stream of American soldiers, supplies, and resources would gradually tip the balance in favor of the Allies, though it would take time for this impact to be fully felt. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, profound changes were unfolding. The Russian Empire, exhausted by years of warfare and internal strife, experienced two revolutions in 1917. The February Revolution saw the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II, while the October Revolution brought Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks to power. The new Soviet government would eventually sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany in March 1918, withdrawing Russia from the war and allowing Germany to redirect its forces to the Western Front. Throughout the warm summer months of 1917, the British launched a major offensive in Flanders, known as the Third Battle of Ypres or Passchendaele. The soft earth, turned to deep mud by autumn rains, created conditions of unimaginable hardship for the soldiers. The quiet whispers of their struggles echo through time tales of men and horses drowning in mud-filled shell holes, of endless artillery barrages, and of gains measured in mere yards. Technology continued its steady evolution, with tanks becoming more reliable and effective. The British Mark IV tank, introduced in 1917, offered improvements over earlier models, while aircraft technology advanced significantly. The skies above the Western Front became increasingly crowded with observation balloons and fighter aircraft, their distant engines humming like mechanical birds. On the home fronts, the steady rhythm of war production continued, but with growing strain. Shortages became more severe, particularly in Germany and Austria-Hungary, where the Allied naval blockade steadily tightened its grip. The quiet suffering of civilians, especially during the turnip winter of 1916–1917, contributed to declining morale and growing calls for peace. These various turning points of 1917 wove together like threads in a tapestry, each contributing to the gradual shift in the war's momentum. The old order was slowly giving way, as new forces, technological, political, and social, emerged to shape the conflict's final phase. The world was changing, quietly but inexorably, as the Great War entered its decisive period. As the harsh winter of 1917 settled over Russia, the strains of war had pushed the nation to its breaking point. The Russian people, weary from years of conflict, food shortages, and military setbacks, began expressing their discontent in ways that would fundamentally reshape both the war and the world. In the cold streets of Petrograd, formerly St. Petersburg, bread lines grew longer as temperatures dropped, while workers and soldiers shared whispered conversations about change. The February Revolution emerged almost spontaneously, beginning with peaceful demonstrations by women marking International Women's Day. These protests gradually swelled as factory workers joined in, their footsteps echoing through the frozen streets as they called for bread and peace. The Tsar's authority crumbled surprisingly quickly, as even his most loyal military units sided with the protesters. By March 15, 1917, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated, ending 3 centuries of Romanov rule in Russia. The provisional government that took power, led by Alexander Kerensky, made the fateful decision to continue Russia's participation in the war, despite the population's overwhelming desire for peace. Through the warm summer months, as golden wheat fields went unharvested due to labor shortages, this new government struggled to maintain order while pursuing the increasingly unpopular war effort. In the background, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, gained support with their simple but powerful promises of peace, land, and bread. Their message resonated particularly strongly among soldiers in the trenches, who passed revolutionary pamphlets from hand to hand, and among peasants who dreamed of owning their own land. The October Revolution unfolded more like a carefully planned operation than a spontaneous uprising. On November 7, 1917, October 25 in the old Russian calendar, Bolshevik forces moved quietly through Petrograd, securing key positions while most citizens slept. The Winter Palace fell with barely a shot fired, its ornate halls and corridors becoming silent witnesses to this historic transition. The new Bolshevik government immediately sought peace with Germany, leading to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918. The terms were harsh. Russia lost vast territories including Finland, the Baltic provinces, Poland, and Ukraine. The sound of boots marching eastward marked the withdrawal of Russian troops from their positions along the Eastern Front, as German forces advanced into the newly surrendered territories. Russia's exit from the war had profound implications for the conflict's final phase. German divisions previously tied down on the Eastern Front could now be transferred west, where they would participate in the massive spring offensive of 1918. Meanwhile, Russia turned inward, descending into a civil war that would transform the former empire into the world's first communist state, creating ripples that would influence global politics for decades to come. As the tide of war continued to shift in 1917, the United States' entry into World War I would prove to be one of the conflict's most decisive developments. Though America had maintained official neutrality since 1914, tensions with Germany had been slowly mounting. The gentle waves of the Atlantic Ocean carried both commerce and conflict between the Old World and the New, as German U-boats threatened American shipping and passengers. The sinking of the British passenger liner Lusitania in 1915, which claimed 128 American lives among its casualties, had already stirred public sentiment. Yet President Woodrow Wilson, reflecting the wishes of many Americans, continued to advocate for peace, winning re-election in 1916 with the slogan, "He kept us out of war." The quiet determination to remain neutral, however, would soon give way to the drums of war. In January 1917, the German government made a fateful decision. The quiet diplomatic channels between Berlin and Washington grew silent as Germany announced its resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare. Like autumn leaves drifting on a breeze, German U-boats would now sink any vessel they encountered in the waters around Britain, neutral or otherwise. The careful balance of American neutrality began to waver. The final push came with the revelation of the Zimmermann telegram in late February 1917. British intelligence had intercepted and decoded a secret German diplomatic communication, proposing an alliance with Mexico against the United States. The message promised to help Mexico recover territories lost to the United States in the previous century. As this news spread across America's amber waves of grain, public opinion shifted decisively toward intervention. On April 2, 1917, President Wilson addressed Congress, asking for a declaration of war against Germany. His words echoed through the halls of the Capitol. The world must be made safe for democracy. 4 days later, on April 6, Congress granted his request, and America officially entered the Great War. The nation's entry was not immediate in military terms, but like a slowly gathering storm, American industry and society began to mobilize. The quiet farms and bustling factories of America turned their attention to the war effort. Young men began to gather at recruitment offices, while women stepped into new roles in factories and offices. The Selective Service Act of May 1917 would eventually register 24 million men, though only about 2.8 million would serve in the military. Under the steady leadership of General John J. Pershing, the American Expeditionary Force began to take shape. Through the warm summer months of 1917, training camps sprang up across the country, as civilian volunteers and draftees alike learned the arts of modern warfare. The first American troops would arrive in France in June 1917, though it would be many months before they would see significant combat. In the spring of 1917, as the war dragged on with seemingly no end in sight, a wave of discontent swept through the French army, leading to one of the most significant internal crises of World War I. The French soldiers, or poilus as they were affectionately known, had endured years of brutal combat, inadequate supplies, and devastating losses. The failed Nivelle offensive, which had promised quick victory but resulted in massive casualties, became the breaking point for many troops. Beginning in April and reaching its peak in May and June, groups of French soldiers began refusing orders to attack. The atmosphere in the trenches grew heavy with whispered conversations and quiet protests. The soldiers, exhausted from endless battles and poor conditions, expressed their dissatisfaction not through violence against their officers, but through peaceful resistance. They would defend their positions if attacked, but refused to participate in what they saw as futile offensive operations. The mutiny spread gradually through different units, affecting roughly half of the French divisions on the Western Front. In the quiet evenings, soldiers would gather in small groups, sharing their grievances about the war's conduct, the quality of their food, and their limited leave time. The sound of soldiers singing peaceful protest songs could sometimes be heard drifting across the countryside. General Philippe Pétain, who replaced the discredited General Robert Nivelle, responded to the crisis with a measured approach. He understood the soldiers' exhaustion and implemented reforms to improve their conditions. Under his guidance, leave rotations became more regular, food quality improved, and rest periods between offensive operations were extended. His famous promise to wait for tanks and Americans reflected a more cautious strategy that resonated with the troops. The French government and military leadership kept the extent of the mutiny secret from their allies and the German forces. They handled the situation delicately, combining disciplinary measures with reforms. While about 3,400 soldiers were court-martialed, only 554 received death sentences, and ultimately just 49 were executed. The majority received more lenient punishments, reflecting an understanding of the legitimate grievances behind their actions. By autumn 1917, the crisis had largely passed. The French army regained its fighting capability, though the experience left a lasting impact on military strategy and soldier welfare. The mutinies demonstrated the importance of maintaining troop morale and the human limits of endurance in modern warfare. This episode, while challenging for the French war effort, ultimately led to improved conditions for soldiers and a more sustainable approach to military operations. As the stalemate of trench warfare continued to claim countless lives, British military planners sought innovative solutions to break the deadlock. In the quiet workshops and testing grounds of England, a revolutionary new weapon was taking shape: the tank. Originally called landships, these armored vehicles were developed in utmost secrecy under the guise of being water carriers for troops in Mesopotamia, hence their eventual code name tanks. The first tanks, known as Mark I, made their debut at the Battle of the Somme on September 15, 1916. On that misty morning, 49 mechanical behemoths slowly crawled across no man's land, their steel plates creaking and engines rumbling as they advanced toward German lines. Though only 32 actually made it into battle due to mechanical difficulties, their psychological impact was profound. German soldiers, having never seen such machines before, were struck with awe and terror at the sight of these iron monsters emerging from the morning fog. The early tanks were far from perfect. Inside, crews of 8 men endured temperatures reaching over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, deafening noise, and the constant jarring motion as their vehicles lurched across the broken ground. The air was thick with fuel fumes and carbon monoxide, while visibility through the narrow viewing slits was extremely limited. Yet despite these challenges, the brave tank crews persevered, knowing they were pioneering a new form of warfare. As 1917 progressed, British engineers continued refining tank design. The Mark IV tank, introduced that spring, featured improved armor and more reliable engines. At the Battle of Cambrai in November 1917, the British deployed 476 tanks in a concentrated attack that achieved remarkable success. Moving steadily forward in the early morning hours, the tanks crushed through German barbed wire and crossed trenches with ease, allowing infantry to advance with minimal casualties. The tanks pushed nearly 6 miles into German territory on the first day, a dramatic achievement compared to previous offensives. Tank warfare continued to evolve through 1918, with the introduction of the lighter, more maneuverable Mark V tank. British forces learned to coordinate tanks with infantry, artillery, and aircraft in combined arms operations. The psychological effect of tanks remained powerful. German troops often surrendered at the sight of approaching tanks rather than face these armored giants. Though tanks did not single-handedly win the war, they marked a turning point in military history. The quiet determination of British engineers and the courage of tank crews helped develop a weapon that would transform warfare in the 20th century. As night fell over the Western Front, the distant rumble of tanks became an increasingly common sound, heralding the dawn of mechanized warfare. As the Great War progressed, technological and medical advancements emerged at an unprecedented pace, driven by the urgent needs of modern warfare. The battlefields of Europe became living laboratories where necessity birthed innovation, though often at a terrible human cost. Let us explore these developments with careful attention to how they shaped both the war and the future of human progress. In the realm of medicine, the war presented challenges that transformed treatment practices. The muddy trenches harbored diseases like trench foot, while new weapons created wounds unlike anything doctors had previously encountered. Military medical units developed innovative techniques for treating shock and blood loss, leading to the first widespread use of blood transfusions on the battlefield. The British Army Blood Transfusion Service, established in 1917, marked a significant advancement in emergency medicine. Facial reconstruction surgery made remarkable strides under pioneers like Harold Gillies, who established a specialized hospital at Sidcup, England. Here, surgeons carefully rebuilt the faces of soldiers damaged by shrapnel and bullets, developing techniques that would influence plastic surgery for generations to come. The gentle hands of nurses and doctors worked tirelessly, their patient care illuminated by gas lamps in field hospitals close to the front lines. X-ray technology, still in its infancy when the war began, became increasingly mobile and sophisticated. Marie Curie herself championed the development of mobile X-ray units, known as petites curies, which brought diagnostic capabilities directly to the battlefield. These units, housed in converted vehicles, saved countless lives by allowing for the precise location of bullets and shrapnel before surgery. The war also accelerated developments in prosthetic limbs, as the number of amputees grew dramatically. Engineers and doctors collaborated to create more functional artificial limbs, working with lightweight materials and innovative joint mechanisms. The quiet workshops where these devices were crafted became places of hope for wounded veterans learning to adapt to their new circumstances. In the realm of military technology, the war saw the refinement of existing weapons and the introduction of new ones. Chemical warfare, though horrific, led to advances in protective equipment. The development of gas masks became increasingly sophisticated, with better filtration systems and more comfortable designs. The soft rubber of the masks and the rhythmic sound of breathing through filters became familiar sensations for soldiers on both sides. Communication technologies evolved significantly, with field telephones becoming more reliable and wireless transmission improving steadily. The gentle clicking of telegraph keys and the whispered conversations through telephone lines became part of the constant background symphony of war, connecting front lines with command centers in ways never before possible. These technological and medical advances, born from the crucible of conflict, would continue to influence civilian life long after the war's end, leaving a lasting legacy of innovation amidst the tragedy of war. As the Great War progressed, the skies above the battlefields became an increasingly important theater of combat. When the conflict began in 1914, aircraft were still a relatively new technology, with the Wright brothers' first flight having taken place just 11 years earlier. Initially, planes were used primarily for reconnaissance, with pilots and observers sketching enemy positions and movements from above the trenches. The development of aerial warfare evolved gradually and peacefully at first. Pilots from opposing sides would sometimes wave to each other as they passed, sharing a quiet camaraderie in the vast expanse of sky. This gentlemanly atmosphere soon changed as military leaders recognized the strategic importance of controlling the airspace above the battlefield. By 1915, pilots began carrying pistols and rifles, though hitting another aircraft while both were in motion proved extremely challenging. The first purpose-built fighter aircraft emerged with the Dutch Fokker Company's innovation of a synchronization gear, allowing machine guns to fire through the propeller without damaging the blades. This development led to the famous Fokker Eindecker, which gave German pilots a significant advantage during the Fokker scourge of late 1915 and early 1916. In response, the Allies developed their own advanced aircraft. The British introduced the Sopwith Pup and later the agile Sopwith Camel, while the French deployed the sturdy Spad fighters. Notable aces emerged on all sides, such as Germany's Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, who claimed 80 victories before his death in April 1918, and France's René Fonck, who survived the war with 75 confirmed victories. Bombing capabilities also evolved throughout the war. Initially, pilots dropped small bombs by hand, but by 1918, specialized bomber aircraft could carry significant payloads. German Gotha bombers conducted raids on British cities, marking the first time civilians far from the front lines faced direct aerial threat in modern warfare. The development of aerial photography transformed military intelligence gathering. Specially designed cameras could capture detailed images of enemy positions, while advances in photo interpretation helped military planners understand the changing battlefield landscape. By war's end, aerial reconnaissance had become an essential element of military planning. Training programs expanded dramatically, though the life expectancy of pilots remained tragically short, often measured in weeks rather than months. The quiet solitude of early morning patrols, the gentle humming of engines, and the vast panorama of clouds and countryside below created an almost peaceful environment that contrasted sharply with the violence of aerial combat. These aviation developments during World War I laid the foundation for modern air power, forever changing the nature of warfare and human flight. The lessons learned and technologies developed would influence military aviation for decades to come, while also contributing to the rapid growth of civilian aviation in the post-war period. The unprecedented scale of casualties and injuries during World War I led to remarkable advances in medical care and treatment. As the wounded streamed into field hospitals and medical stations, doctors and nurses were forced to innovate and develop new techniques that would forever change the practice of medicine. One of the most significant medical developments came in the treatment of infected wounds. The muddy, bacteria-laden trenches meant that even minor injuries frequently became seriously infected. Dr. Alexis Carroll and chemist Henry Dakin collaborated to create the Carroll-Dakin solution, a gentle antiseptic that could be continuously dripped into wounds, dramatically reducing infection rates and saving countless lives. Blood transfusion techniques also evolved rapidly during the war. The discovery and implementation of blood typing and the use of sodium citrate as an anticoagulant allowed blood to be stored for longer periods, making transfusions more widely available to the wounded. The development of mobile blood banks, first introduced by Canadian Dr. Lawrence Bruce Robertson, became a crucial innovation that brought life-saving care closer to the front lines. The war saw significant improvements in orthopedic surgery and the treatment of broken bones. The Thomas splint, developed by Hugh Owen Thomas and widely implemented by his nephew Robert Jones, reduced mortality rates from femur fractures from 80% to 20%. In the quiet moments between battles, medical teams would practice and refine their techniques for setting complex fractures. Facial reconstruction surgery made remarkable strides under pioneers like Harold Gillies, who established the first hospital dedicated to facial repairs at Sidcup, England. In the peaceful countryside setting, artists would carefully document patients' injuries and progress through detailed drawings, while surgeons developed new techniques for rebuilding damaged faces using tissue flaps and skin grafts. The psychological impact of warfare also received newfound attention. The condition, initially called shell shock, led to a greater understanding of what we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder. Doctors like Charles Myers and William Rivers developed therapeutic approaches that would influence psychiatric treatment for generations to come. Perhaps most importantly, the war accelerated the development of rehabilitation medicine. The need to help wounded soldiers return to civilian life led to advances in prosthetic limbs, physical therapy techniques, and occupational therapy. Quiet hospital wards became spaces of healing and learning, where medical professionals worked patiently with injured veterans to help them regain independence and dignity. These medical advances, born from the tragedy of war, would go on to benefit civilian medicine for decades to come, creating a lasting legacy of improved patient care and treatment methods that continues to influence medical practice today. As the Great War progressed, the vital importance of communications became increasingly apparent, transforming how armies coordinated their movements and how information flowed across the vast theaters of war. The traditional methods of sending messages by horse-mounted couriers gradually gave way to more sophisticated technologies that would forever change the nature of warfare and civilian life alike. Among the most significant innovations was the widespread adoption of field telephone systems. Miles of telephone wire were carefully laid in trenches, and along strategic routes, allowing commanders to coordinate troops and receive updates from the front lines with unprecedented speed. The sound of telephone operators quietly working in dugouts became a constant backdrop to the war, their hushed voices carrying vital information through copper wires stretching across the scarred landscape. Wireless telegraphy, though still in its relative infancy, proved invaluable for maintaining contact with ships at sea and coordinating naval operations. The gentle clicking of Morse code transmitters could be heard in radio rooms across the Western Front, as operators carefully transcribed messages that could mean the difference between victory and defeat. The British Royal Navy, in particular, developed an extensive network of wireless stations that helped maintain their crucial naval blockade of Germany. Signal flags, heliographs, and carrier pigeons continued to play important roles when electronic communications were disrupted. These faithful pigeons, housed in mobile lofts just behind the lines, carried thousands of messages throughout the war, their soft cooing providing a peaceful counterpoint to the distant sounds of artillery. One famous pigeon, named Cher Ami, was awarded the Croix de Guerre for delivering 12 important messages during the Battle of Verdun. The war also saw significant advances in codes and ciphers, as nations sought to protect their communications from interception. The quiet work of cryptographers in London's Room 40 led to the famous decryption of the Zimmermann telegram, which helped bring the United States into the war. These dedicated code breakers worked in hushed rooms, poring over intercepted messages day and night, their patient efforts gradually revealing crucial intelligence. For civilians, the war years saw the emergence of more organized propaganda and mass communication systems. Newspapers reached unprecedented circulation numbers, while new photographic techniques allowed people at home to see images from the front, though carefully censored. The soft rustle of newspaper pages and the quiet murmur of people discussing the latest news became part of the daily rhythm of wartime life in cities and villages across Europe and beyond. These communications innovations would have lasting effects long after the war ended, laying the groundwork for the modern telecommunications age and forever changing how societies share and receive information. The gentle hum of progress in communications technology continued to echo through the decades that followed, its origins in the urgent necessities of the Great War. The evolution of industrial warfare during World War I marked a profound transformation in how nations waged war, as the conflict became the first truly mechanized war in human history. The peaceful factories and workshops of Europe were gradually converted into vast arsenals, producing weapons and equipment on an unprecedented scale. This industrial mobilization would forever change the nature of warfare. In the quiet manufacturing centers of Britain, France, and Germany, the steady hum of machinery grew ever louder as production lines were retooled for war materials. The British Ministry of Munitions, established in 1915 under David Lloyd George, coordinated the efforts of over 4,000 government-controlled establishments, their rhythmic output measuring the pulse of industrial warfare. Women increasingly entered these factories, their skilled hands assembling shells, aircraft parts, and other vital equipment. The gentle whir of lathes and the methodical tapping of riveting tools became the constant soundtrack of their daily lives. In Germany, the Hindenburg Program of 1916 sought to double munitions production, transforming civilian industries into military suppliers under the careful oversight of Walter Rathenau. The evolution of industrial warfare brought forth new weapon systems that would reshape the battlefield. The tank, first introduced by the British at the Battle of the Somme in 1916, emerged from engineering workshops as a response to trench warfare. These early Mark I tanks, though slow and unreliable, moved deliberately across the scarred landscape at walking pace, their steel plates offering protection to the crews within. Artillery production reached astounding levels, with factories working around the clock. The Krupp Works in Essen, Germany, produced over 3,000 heavy guns during the war, While France's Schneider-Kraussat works manufactured countless 75 field guns, their production lines flowing like steady streams feeding into the war effort. Chemical warfare emerged as another industrial innovation, with German chemists like Fritz Haber developing increasingly sophisticated gas weapons. The quiet laboratories where these weapons were developed contrasted sharply with their devastating effects on the battlefield. Meanwhile, gas mask production became a priority for all nations, with rubber factories adapting their peaceful production lines to meet this new defensive need. The standardization of manufacturing processes and the introduction of assembly line techniques revolutionized military production. In America's factories, the methodical approach of mass production, pioneered by Henry Ford, was applied to military equipment. The Liberty Truck program of 1917 demonstrated how industrial efficiency could be applied to war materiel, with standardized parts and coordinated production across multiple facilities. This industrial transformation extended beyond weapons to include everything from uniform production to food preservation. Countless factories produced the mundane but essential items of war: boots, buttons, bandages, and countless other necessities that sustained the massive armies in the field. The steady flow of these supplies, moving like a gentle river from factory to front, became the lifeblood of the war effort. As 1918 dawned across the war-torn landscapes of Europe, few could have predicted that this would be the final year of the Great War. The cold winter months saw armies huddled in their trenches, while behind the scenes, momentous changes were taking shape that would ultimately determine the conflict's outcome. In the early months of 1918, Germany launched its last major offensive, known as the Spring Offensive or Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's Battle. Having secured peace with Russia through the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the German High Command transferred hundreds of thousands of troops to the Western Front, hoping to achieve victory before American forces could arrive in significant numbers. The German advance initially made remarkable progress, pushing the Allied lines back farther than any offensive since 1914. The sound of German artillery grew closer to Paris, and the city's residents could hear the distant thunder of long-range guns. Yet this advance came at a tremendous cost, as German soldiers, weakened by years of blockade and shortages, struggled to maintain their momentum. As spring turned to summer, the tide gradually began to turn. American troops were now arriving at a rate of 10,000 per day, bringing fresh energy and resources to the Allied cause. The warm summer air carried the sounds of different languages mingling in the trenches: English, French, American English, and the various dialects of the British Empire's colonial troops, all united in common purpose. The Allied counteroffensive, known as the 100 Days Offensive, began on August 8, 1918, a day German General Ludendorff would later call the Black Day of the German Army. The early morning mist concealed the approach of hundreds of Allied tanks, supported by aircraft overhead, as they broke through the German lines near Amiens. Throughout the autumn months, the Allied advance continued steadily. The familiar pattern of trench warfare gave way to a more mobile conflict, as improved tactics and technology allowed for successful breakthrough operations. The scent of victory began to mingle with the falling leaves, even as exhausted soldiers on both sides yearned for peace. Behind the lines, the Central Powers began to crumble. Bulgaria surrendered in September, followed by the Ottoman Empire in October. The Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolved into its component parts as nationalism and war-weariness took their toll. Finally, after a naval mutiny and civilian unrest, Germany itself sought an armistice. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, the guns fell silent along the Western Front. In Paris, London, and countless other cities, people emerged into the streets to celebrate, while in the trenches, soldiers sat quietly, almost unable to believe that 4 years of unprecedented warfare had finally come to an end. In the early months of 1918, As winter's grip began to loosen across the Western Front, German military leaders prepared for what they hoped would be a decisive series of offensives. Known as the Spring Offensive, or Operation Michael, this ambitious campaign represented Germany's last major attempt to win the war before American forces could arrive in substantial numbers. General Erich Ludendorff, the chief architect of this strategy, had carefully planned the offensive using lessons learned from previous battles. The German army had developed new stormtrooper tactics, where specially trained soldiers would infiltrate enemy lines in small groups, bypassing strong points and seeking weak spots in the Allied defenses. These innovative tactics marked a significant departure from the rigid mass infantry attacks that had characterized much of the war. On March 21, 1918, the offensive began in the pre-dawn hours with an enormous artillery bombardment that included both high-explosive shells and poison gas. The morning fog, mixed with the artificial smoke screen, created an ethereal atmosphere across the battlefield. Through this misty veil, German stormtroopers advanced, moving quietly and methodically through gaps in the British lines. Initially, the offensive achieved remarkable success. The British Fifth Army, commanded by General Hubert Gough, was pushed back significantly. The Germans advanced up to 40 miles in places, the deepest penetration of Allied lines since the beginning of trench warfare. The peaceful French countryside, which had remained relatively unchanged for years of static warfare, suddenly became a landscape of movement and transformation. However, the success of the German advance carried within it the seeds of its own failure. As the troops pushed forward, they outran their supply lines and artillery support. The soldiers, already weakened by years of inadequate rations due to the British naval blockade, found themselves exhausted. Many couldn't resist the temptation to stop and raid captured Allied supply dumps, finding food and drink they hadn't seen in years. The Allied response, though initially confused, gradually became more coordinated. Under the newly appointed Supreme Allied Commander, Ferdinand Foch, British and French reserves were methodically deployed to threatened sectors. The Germans, unable to maintain their momentum, found their advance gradually slowing, then stopping altogether by early April. The Spring Offensive, while impressive in its initial execution, ultimately failed to achieve its strategic objectives. It represented both the height of German military innovation and the last gasp of their wartime strength. The human cost was enormous, with hundreds of thousands of casualties on both sides, leaving the German army critically weakened for the Allied counteroffensives that would follow in the summer months. After the German Spring Offensive had exhausted itself, the Allied forces began to gather their strength for what would become the decisive counteroffensive of the war. In the warm summer days of 1918, a renewed sense of possibility emerged among the Allied commanders. Marshal Ferdinand Foch, now Supreme Commander of Allied forces, carefully coordinated the planning of what would become known as the 100 Days Offensive. The counteroffensive began quietly on July 18, 1918, with the Second Battle of the Marne. French and American forces, moving through morning mist and gentle rainfall, caught the Germans by surprise. The soft rumble of tanks and the steady march of infantry marked the beginning of a new phase of warfare, one where the Allies would consistently push forward rather than merely hold their ground.